Early in the morning, 70-year-old Margaret Jones boarded a plane bound for New York for a long journey. When she found her seat, she realized the person sitting next to her was a well-dressed and quiet black man, David Brown. Although David's polished appearance and calm demeanor initially caught her attention, Margaret's deep-seated prejudices immediately made her uncomfortable. As Margaret settled into her seat with slow, deliberate movements, she frowned and muttered under her breath, "I didn't pay this much to end up in this situation." Her words were loud enough for a few nearby passengers to hear. David noticed her uneasy behavior, but chose to remain composed, turning his gaze toward the window and staying silent. Margaret, emboldened by his silence, voiced her discomfort even more loudly. "I'm an elderly woman. I have a long journey ahead. Couldn't they have seated me next to someone more appropriate? I just don't feel comfortable." David took a deep breath and, striving to maintain his patience, replied kindly, "Ma'am, I have no intention of making you uncomfortable. I'm simply here to quietly complete my journey. Perhaps we could show a little understanding toward one another." This calm and mature response was not enough to pacify Margaret. Her face flushed with frustration as she raised her hand to summon the flight attendant. "This won't do. Flight attendant, could you come here, please? I'd like my seat changed. I can't feel at ease sitting next to this man." David maintained his composure and, before the attendant arrived, turned to Margaret again and said, "Ma'am, what have I done to upset you so much? I'm simply sitting here, trying to travel. Please, don't judge people by their appearance. Perhaps, during this long flight, we could even learn something from each other." Margaret ignored his kind words and snapped back with even more hostility. "Don't try to lecture me. I have the right to a peaceful journey, and that's impossible with you sitting here. What's wrong with wanting to sit somewhere else? Is that too much to ask?" Despite her attitude, David remained calm, bowing his head slightly as he spoke in a measured tone. "As a fellow passenger, it saddens me that something so small has caused you such discomfort. If there's a problem, I'll do my best to address it. But please remember, people should be judged not by their looks, but by their hearts." Margaret let out a mocking laugh and turned to the flight attendant, who had just arrived. "Do you hear what he's saying? I don't have to sit here and listen to this. Please find me another seat." The flight attendant, trying to de-escalate the situation, responded politely, "Ma'am, please remain calm. I'll assess the situation immediately. However, there are no available seats at the moment. We'll do our best to ensure your comfort." Margaret was not satisfied with this answer and leaned back in her seat, continuing to grumble under her breath. David, meanwhile, turned back to the window and took a deep breath. The unpleasant start to the flight weighed on him, but he was determined to handle the situation with patience and grace. The tension in the cabin was palpable, and the other passengers exchanged curious and concerned glances. Everyone was eager to see how this encounter would unfold. The flight attendants carefully assessed the situation, listening politely to Margaret's complaints. However, they couldn't ignore David's quiet composure and patience, which left a deep impression on them. One of the attendants approached David and said, "Sir, we understand this has been an uncomfortable situation. To ensure your comfort, we'd like to offer you a seat in the business class." David nodded with a polite smile. "Of course," he replied. As he stood up, he turned to Margaret and, in a calm and measured tone, added, "Ma'am, I'm moving seats to ensure your comfort. I hope the rest of your journey is more pleasant." Margaret was stunned and left speechless. David's grace and maturity made her feel even more uncomfortable. Meanwhile, murmurs began to spread among the other passengers. Many were visibly upset with Margaret's behavior, casting judgmental glances in her direction. David quietly gathered his belongings and followed the flight attendant to the business class section. The atmosphere he left behind, however, grew increasingly heavy for Margaret. Despite David's courteous and dignified demeanor, Margaret's actions had not gone unnoticed by the other passengers. As a young woman passed by Margaret's seat, she leaned in and whispered, "You should be ashamed of yourself." The words hit Margaret like a dagger, but she tried to maintain her composure. Another passenger, unable to hold back, spoke up loudly from their seat. It's 2025 and racism still exists. How can people like this still be among us? The cabin, which had been filled with tense silence, was now buzzing with disapproval. A man further down the aisle turned toward Margaret and said mockingly, "That man behaved far more honorably than you ever could. How does that make you feel?" The succession of remarks left Margaret feeling cornered and humiliated. Her face turned red, and her hands trembled as she sat frozen in her seat. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the condemning stares and biting words. But the echoes of the passengers' disapproval lingered in her ears. Internally, Margaret couldn't help but reflect on David's calm and respectful behavior toward her. He never lost his dignity with me, but what about me? She thought, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. Admitting this to herself, however, felt like an unbearable blow to her pride. A few moments later, a young passenger stopped in the aisle near Margaret's seat, locking eyes with her briefly. With a slight nod, the passenger said, "Everyone makes mistakes, but it's important to recognize the gravity of this one." Margaret lowered her head in shame, unable to muster a response. For the remainder of the flight, Margaret was overwhelmed by a profound sense of guilt and regret. All eyes seemed to remain on her, and she could feel their silent judgment. She tried closing her eyes again, but neither the passengers' reactions nor David's kind gaze would leave her mind. If only I had acted differently from the start, she thought. These feelings made each passing moment of the flight even harder to endure. Yet, amidst the shame, Margaret began to sense that this could be a turning point, an opportunity to confront her prejudices and grow from the experience. As the plane began its descent, Margaret sat at the back, alone and lost in thought. When she reached down to retrieve her bag, a pen slipped from her grasp and fell to the floor. Her aging hands struggled to pick it up, but before she could, a pair of elegant hands reached down and returned it to her. It was David. Looking directly into her eyes, David spoke with gentle kindness. "People make mistakes, ma'am. What matters is learning from them. I hope your journey has been a good one." Margaret's eyes welled up with tears. "Mr. Brown, my behavior toward you was inexcusable. I am so deeply sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. David responded with a warm smile. "We all have a past, but we all have the potential for a better future. What truly matters is how we choose to treat one another moving forward." At that moment, Margaret realized for the first time in her life how deeply mistaken her prejudices had been. David's calm and dignified demeanor had entirely shifted her perspective. What had transpired during the flight became a profound lesson in humanity for everyone on board. As Margaret exited the plane, she watched David in silence. Many passengers smiled at him and thanked him for his grace and kindness. Margaret, filled with a mixture of shame and determination, silently vowed to spend the rest of her life correcting the mistakes she had made and confronting her own biases. The story that unfolded on that flight served as a powerful reminder to everyone present of the futility of racism and the strength that comes from compassion and humanity. This tale of broken prejudices and the power of kindness resonated with all who witnessed it. Let us choose love and empathy to build a world where we all stand together, it concluded. If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this. Together, let's take steps toward a world filled with love and empathy.